at the promises, prayer, plans, and progress that God was making with this amazing group of people who decided to make a difference and decided to not leave things as they are. Now, what started with brothers who came to Nehemiah at chapter 1, they came to him with some seriously bad news. There was a mess in their hometown. Do you remember this? And what started as a mess turned into rebuilt walls. A recommitment to the book, to the ways of the book. A massive recommitment to the house of God. People were charged with excitement as what had been destroyed for generations was now rebuilt in the matter of less than 2 months. Now, none of this comes without struggle. How many realize that no matter what we do in life, if we're taking on a big project or we're asked to do something beyond what we've been doing, it's kind of a stretch for our capacity, how many realize that that's not always easy? How many realize that potentially you're going to have problems, difficulties? And how many also realize that there are people in and around our lives that don't make that new task easy? Have you ever noticed that? And it happened with Nehemiah. It wasn't like they just started and it was all great. Everybody's gung-ho, they're going for it. No, there was real difficulty. There was the threat of violence. There was people making fun of them. Saying, "What are you doing?" You remember this phrase? We'll come back to this a little bit later today. But do you remember this phrase? I mean, look at that wall. If a fox were to run on that wall, it'd fall over. Do you remember that? When Tobiah was making fun of the process that God had them in. And sometimes, in the midst of all the celebration, in the midst of that anticipation for what could be, there are difficulties. There are naysayers. There are people who try to get us or them off of what God had called them to do. And last week, we ended by showing how leaders stepped up and volunteered to live in the city. Do you remember that? There was the leaders who said, "We're all in. We are fully engaged. Yes, the infrastructure isn't all there. Yes, there's still rubble everywhere. Yes, there's still difficulties. Yes, there aren't new roads. There's no houses. I mean, where are you going to live without a house?" They had all these different challenges, but the leaders said, "We are all in." And then what they ended up doing is they picked one out of every 10, and we said, "We need you to live there," and then count down the road, that we need you to live there. And they started picking people to re-inhabit this place. There was a celebration, as there were 2 sets of worship that were happening. So there was one set came in and worship, and a lot was happening and celebrating, and then another group came in and were celebrating. There was a lot going on. There were people who were generous, so generous, in fact, that they had to set up rooms in the temple, and they said, "Now we need you people to guard all the stuff." That's a lot if you think about it. Because all of a sudden a nation re-engages the ways of God. A nation re-engages the things that God had asked them to do, and there was just provision. We find ministers who are now not in the fields ministering, but they're in the temple, actively engaged in temple life and helping the people reestablish those ways that had been lost. They were building infrastructure, homes. Sounds like a new motto that we sort of touched on last week, is that we bring your faith home. What do we do here at IVC? We bring your faith home. Now, I want us to see this because here we are 12 years into the journey, 12 years into the story of Nehemiah. We're up to chapter 13, but it just happens to be 13. But there was 12 years that Nehemiah had worked in that city, was the governor of that place, and was trying to institute the practice of the Bible again. He was making sure that things were in order. He was making sure that the people were doing what they had committed to do. I remember when I went to Estonia the very first time, And I get off to the airport. I was going to see Mai. She had been there translating at a Bible school. And this is a post-Soviet country, just really short period of time that they were free. They had reestablished themselves. And I got off the plane, and man, the airport was a mess. I mean, it was just something I was not expecting. I had never been overseas before, right? I mean, it's not like I went to Mexico or Canada or somewhere close. I actually went to Estonia, which was a post-Soviet country when I went there. And I remember those first 6 months living there thinking there was a sense of excitement that something was happening here. I didn't understand it. And I would wonder when we came back, and Maya and I had gotten married in Estonia, we went back to the States, kind of went back to normal life, wondered what was going on in this amazing little country. And it was a couple of years before we went back, but when we went the next time, oh my goodness, so much had happened in a really short period of time. There were new roads, new buildings, the airport was being reconstructed. All of a sudden, Mercedes decided to open up one showroom, and their goal was sell one car in the whole year, just one. And if they sold one, that would have been a success. In the first year that Mercedes was in Estonia, they sold 10 cars. Now, that might not be a lot to you, but I'm saying that was huge. As soon as that happened, every car manufacturing company flooded the market. And when that happened, opportunities, you just saw opportunities happening everywhere. I remember driving from the airport to the place where we were staying and thinking, something is different, something has changed. And it was only just a couple of years. Nehemiah had been with these people for 12 years. I want you to imagine 12 years of an industrious people who say, we're committed to do something. Imagine the redevelopment that's happening. Imagine how temple life had been restored. Imagine, if you would, new houses being raised. In Estonia, we'd see these crazy big buildings being made. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, it's like a weird situation. We have this beautiful old town and this massive new town sitting side by side. Malls had sprung up in Estonia. Estonian designers leapt into the action and flooded the market. It was just amazing. And we don't know how long Nehemiah had been out away from Jerusalem at this time as we start into chapter 13, but something changed. Now, if you remember, if you watched the videos that we had sent to you about, or said, for everybody to watch the video from thebibleproject.com about Nehemiah, both Ezra and Nehemiah are very anticlimactical books. It seems like things are going well, and right at the end, things just seem to fall apart. And I wonder, to me, this is one of the reasons why I think the Bible is a book like none other, because it's honest. It's not everything works in the end. It's not the movie that starts and ends, because every story is so unique. You see the failures of people's lives in this book. And you see a group of people as we look at Nehemiah 13, and you think, how did they do this? How did they slip so far? The title of today's message, we'll read this first. The title of today's message is, How Quickly They Forget. Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 6 and 7. We're not starting in verse 1 on purpose, because I want you to hear this. He says, while all this was happening, I was not in Jerusalem, because I had returned to King Artaxerxes of Babylon in the 32nd year of his reign. It was only later that I had asked the king for a leave of absence so I could return to Jerusalem. Something had happened. He had sensed it was time to go back, time to revisit. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1. Here's what we find out. At the time, the book of Moses was read publicly to the people. The command was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the Israelites with food and water. Instead, they hired Balaam against them to curse them. But our God turned the curse into blessing. When they read the law, they separated all those of mixed descent from Israel. Now, Nehemiah was not around when this happened. I kind of wonder what he would have done if this was an even attempt to happen. Because right at the outset, you could think, yeah, that makes sense. They read the Bible. They did what the Bible said. But did they? Is that what the Bible said? This is where we as followers of Jesus, as disciples of the way, need to know the story of the book. We need to know what this says, actually. And I would encourage you to not take my word for it. Go and read it. If you're not sure about what I'm saying, please find it in the book. Because what you find is, he was referring to, or the people were referring to, Deuteronomy chapter 23. And in Deuteronomy 23, you would be embarrassed by the kinds of people. If I were to read chapter 23 to you, just starting in verse 1, it would be highly embarrassing for me to read those things. Go ahead and take a look at it. Because all of a sudden there were certain people that were allowed into the temple, certain people that were not allowed into the temple. This was a challenging story. Because it turns out that the Ammonites and the Moabites were people, as the people of God left Egypt, traveling through the desert. What happened? They entered into this area, and the Moabites and the Ammonites were not going to help the Jewish people. We're not giving you any water. We're not giving you any land. We're not giving you any food. Please move on. And they ended up hiring some kind of a prophet, that the Bible calls him a prophet. His name was Balaam, some kind of a prophet, to say, prophesy evil things, prophesy a curse. And Balaam's like, he's thinking about it. He likes the money. He's like, money, 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 money. And he's like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. But I'll tell you how to get God to curse his people, get them to sin. It's a weird one, but it's in the Bible. And so it was the Ammonites and the Moabites that God said, we don't want anything to do with these people, right? Is that what it says? You'll go ahead and read it. Trust me when I say it, that's what it says. Now, the scripture, though, in 13, says what? When they had heard the law, they separated all of those of mixed descent. Not just the Ammonites and the Moabites. They said, anyone who's mixed, we want you out. And what do I read out of this? That legalism always leads to death. Love always leads to life. Because what was happening here was what I would call a new form of legalism. Seems like they're doing the right thing, but it wasn't. They took what God had said and they took it one step further. Anytime you take what God says and you make it into something else, you create the rules and the regulations to monitor everything, especially the things that God doesn't say, it leads to death. Legalism leads to death. But why would I say legalism or a new form of legalism? Because the people went beyond the book and came up with another rule. This is really important. What do I mean by legalism leads to death? The Bible tells us, Paul writing to the church at Corinth, in this back and forth conversation, what does he say? The letter, it's right there. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. The Spirit gives life. The letter will always kill. See, what starts off as grace, and the grace of God working through this people, began to turn into a bunch of rules that went beyond the Bible. There's a deadness that settles on a place, on a people, on a movement when you create rules and you push out life. Read church history, you'll see it. God never told the people or the priests to separate all of the people of mixed descent, yet that is what they did. And as an aside, do you know who the great-grandmother of King David was? A Moabite whose name was Ruth. Kind of makes you go, See, part of our challenge as human beings is we have a tendency to want to control. And if I can make enough rules, I can control your behavior. Here's a bunch of do's, here's a bunch of don'ts. I am not saying that rules are bad. But when the rules go beyond the book, and what we do is create a form of godliness, but there's no power because there's no life. Because why? Love leads to life. D.A. Carson, who is not a liberal by any stretch of the imagination, if you knew who he was, he writes about this chapter 13. Instead of casting themselves on the mercy of God, they start surrounding themselves with endless rules that they can always justify in some way or other by appealing loosely to something or other in the Bible. But the authority of the Bible somehow gets trumped by external rules that go several steps beyond what the Bible says. I've heard it put it this way, that the problem with the garden was that the tree meant more to Adam and Eve than the God who made the tree. See, the tree became the focus, not the God who made it. And when we get that backwards, legalism will lead to death. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. See, all of a sudden, you remember the guy Tobiah? One of the agitators? We had just talked about him. Well, he had a relative who happened to be a priest. And what did the priest do? He said, remember that place where we stored all of God's things, the things that people gave? You know what we're going to do? We're going to move all of that out so that Tobiah can move in. So he made him a penthouse apartment in the temple of God and removed the stuff that belonged to God and gave it to someone who was their enemy. That doesn't sound like things are going pretty well, does it? It sounds like in a really short period of time. Now, we don't know how long Nehemiah was back in Susa. But we do know that this is happening in the background. It doesn't sound like very long before people began to let things slip. And Tobiah wasn't one of God's people. If they're separating everybody, why is he still there? One of the things that Maya used to tell me was really funny when we were living in Estonia. She said, back in the Soviet days, yes, everyone's supposed to have the same things. Everything was supposed to be equal. But for some people, their equal was more than other people's equal. So the rules get shifted. Why? Because legalism leads to death. But love leads to life. So here we pick up in verse 6, and Nehemiah comes back. He's not a happy camper. He's upset. Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 8 and 9 says, I was greatly displeased. What does he do? He throws all of Tobiah's household possessions out of the room. And he ordered that the rooms be purified. And he had the articles of God restored there, along with the grain offering and the frankincense. I would have loved to see that scene. You've seen the commercial where the guy and girl break up, and the girl's just throwing his stuff out the window, and you see the TV, whoosh, you see his clothes go out the window. I would have loved to have been there to see all of Tobiah's junk being thrown right out the window, right into the street. We're done with this. We are cleaning house. And he goes back to purifying. In 13, verses 10 and 11, I also find out that because of the portions of the Levites had not been given, that the Levites, the singers, performers of the service, had gone back to their own field. Therefore, I rebuked the officials, asking, why has the house of God been neglected? Remember, I told you this is an anticlimactical story. It ends in a really strange way. 12 years of investing his life into the rebuild of the wall, into creating the kind of focus that got people moving in one direction, and in a short period of time. I mean, remember, just a couple of chapters ago, not too very long ago, that they had recommitted their life to the ways of God. They had said, yes, God, we're going to do these things. They had asked for forgiveness. They've gone through periods of purification. They had done so much. And in a really short period of time, they let things go. And you've got to remember that at the beginning of this, Nehemiah's big idea was the Messiah's coming. He needs a house. He's coming to this city. Why is it a mess? So Nehemiah's heart, I mean, I wish, if you've ever had a vision from God, something to do with your life, something that you know, you want to see something happen in your family, something in your business, something in the ministry that God's called you to, something that's bigger than yourself, and you realize you're going to fully commit to that thing, it's big on the inside of you. It's much bigger than you. Because the expanse that God puts in us is huge because He's big. And so could you imagine, his heart is exploding. It's happening. The city is rebuilt. I have a place for the Messiah. Temple life has been restored. All these things are going great. This is awesome. And then Tobiah? You got to be kidding me. In God's house? Where are all the ministers? They're back in their field. Because the people forgot. They forgot to engage. They forgot to give. They forgot to set apart the things that belong to God. They absolutely forgot. And all the people, the singers and the Levites, the priests, the security, all these guys who had been working in the things of God all realized, I got to go back to work. I got to go back to the field. Now, maybe that doesn't mean a whole lot for you. But I'm telling you, when people who are called and committed to full-time work with God, and you see it happen, when that capacity gets diminished and diminished and diminished and you can't, it's a frustration that you wouldn't understand. Not because we need to work in church, but because there's a vision that God placed in the hearts of people to do something with God's people, to see His kingdom come, His will being done here in Birmingham as it is in heaven. And if each one of us did our part, man, imagine what we could do if we all did our part. So what does leadership do? What does Nehemiah do? He snaps things right back into place. He says, there's a lot of slack over here. There's a lot of slack over here. And he begins to cut and purify and call people to recommit. Why? He created an incredible sense of focus. When we forget our purpose and lose our focus, decline is on its way. Any business, you know this, if you've been in business, if you lose focus of where you're going, what is it that we're called to? What is this business that we're a part of? And you lose focus of what the goal is, the business will decline. When a husband and wife lose focus of what God's called that couple to be, one, what happens? The decline of the relationship. When a student loses focus and they forget the end in mind, what happens? They're living in your basement till they're 40, playing video games. Not in my house. What happens when a church forgets its purpose and loses focus? It's a matter of time before the doors of the church are shuttered closed. We have to remember our focus, remember our purpose, and not lose our focus. What did Nehemiah do? He refocused them by reminding them what is their purpose. What is our purpose? What is the purpose of IVC? That everyone would come to know Jesus who needs to know him. That everyone who is hurting, broken, or bruised can find healing. What is our purpose? To bring your faith home. We're here to love God, share God's love, and introduce people to Jesus. Why are we doing 2 Easter services and then 2 services the following week? Because it is my high expectation that each one of us will do our absolute best to invite people to come and hear about Jesus. That's my anticipation. That's my desire. Why do I talk about small groups so often? Because small groups are the primary tool for discipleship here at IVC. It's in these groups, in these people's homes, where relationships are built, spiritual gifts can be practiced, we're able to check into each other's lives, hold each other accountable to the ways of Jesus. Through these groups and the multiplication of these groups, we'll see more and more people become discipled to become all that God has called them to be. You might think that's narrow. It's not. It's just focused. When I see mission drift, it's my job to call things to focus. When all of a sudden vision starts to go sideways, we're not really sure where we're going, what's my job? My job as a leader is to call us as a community to focus. Hey guys, we're going this way. Where are we going? This way. What are we doing? We're doing these things. Nehemiah had to jerk the slack out of what was going on. And then there's this strange prayer. Remember me for this. Don't erase the deeds of this faith. Don't erase the deeds of faithful love I have done for the house of my God and for its services. Sounds nice, but is it? He prays this prayer 4 different times. When you read it, you understand Nehemiah. He's actually saying something more like this: God, I did everything right. It's these people who screwed up. He was distancing himself from the story. Sounds a bit like Adam and Eve. It was the serpent. It was that woman. Right? I believe that almost everything we read in Scripture, we go right back to the beginning, find that in Genesis, and it's like, yep, that's where we started. That's where it began. You can see it right there. The people had forgotten about the Sabbath. They're working again on the Sabbath. They're trading again. They're doing everything that God had commanded them not to do. And they knew this. Nehemiah knew that this would cause their destruction because that's why the walls were destroyed to begin with. And he could see a pattern being redeveloped. He could see a pattern locking in again. And he did not like it. What did he do? He kicked all those people out. He said, we're not trading on the Sabbath. We're not doing it. Matter of fact, to a group of people who decided we're going to camp out along the wall, he came out and said, if I see you here again, I'm going to move you. You got to read it. I mean, it's a crazy story. What are we learning through all of this? Rebuilding, renewal, revitalizing, reintroducing, all of it takes focus. And then all of a sudden you read again, and there's that prayer. Remember me, God. Look on compassion with me, God. God, I'm doing my part. It's these people. The rest of the chapter is also a bit strange. Remember, Nehemiah is the governor. He starts pulling people's hair out. He pulls people's beards out. I mean, we're talking full-on aggression. I think he's got some anger issues. Ken Coward said he would be more than willing to allow us to demonstrate. Ken, were you? No, you're all right with that? You're fine? I mean, it was kind of weird when you read this. What happened was that people began to marry outside of people of Jewish faith and of that people group. And what was the problem with that? For one, God had a plan that he had made a covenant with Abraham with to reveal himself to a people. That through these people, the Messiah would come and he would fix everything. But remember, in Jesus' lineage, there's a Moabite named Ruth. Remember Rahab? Anybody remember Rahab? Right? She was not a Jew. You read through the scripture, you find there's an interesting pattern. Why? Legalism leads to death, but love leads to life. And I think verse 24 tells us what was going on. He said, half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and the other one of the other peoples, but could not speak Hebrew. What was going on? Kids were growing up and they couldn't read the book. They couldn't follow the book. And this was upsetting because the farther you get from the book, the farther you get from truth. The farther you get from this, the farther you get from him. And he knew that they couldn't read, so they couldn't find the stories for themselves. They wouldn't be able to read them if they found it. What is that language? Why am I reading backwards and upside down? I don't understand this. When you read this, I can't help, slight tangent, I can't help but think of the evil of racism. Right here in 2019. Sadly, racism is still very alive. Sometimes it gets masked as the word nationalism. But when you push into it, it's racist. I don't know about you, but I was incredibly challenged over the last few weeks, whether it was a video of some young kids or hearing about a group of people who were slaughtered in New Zealand, all for various reasons. It makes my heart sick. When we look around this room, what do I see? I see blacks, I see Hispanics, Asians, whites, islanders, all kinds of people from all kinds of places. Last week we had a guest with us, and the guest said to me after the service, he said, "You guys are a really diverse group of people." And I just take it for granted. I don't really see it because I don't see that way. But in some places, Sunday is still the most segregated hour in the country. But as much as racism is alive, I Have a Dream is also still very alive. The problem for Nehemiah was that the people, within a short period of time, had fallen away from the ways of the book. He points to Solomon as an example. But the explanation was that these foreign women had led him into sin. What does Nehemiah do? So I purified them from everything foreign and assigned specific duties of the priests and the Levites. I also arranged for the donations of wood to the appointed times and for the first fruits. He creates focus again, reminding people of their purpose. And in the most anticlimactical way a book can end, He ends with the famous prayer that we've already read a couple of times. Remember me, God, with favor. I did the right things. It's these people. They're the problem. What do I hope for us to learn from all that we have read over the last 10 weeks? That God has called us to rebuild, revitalize, reintroduce IVC community. That's what He's called us to. And we're going to be focused, with focused attention, to make sure we're doing what God has called us to do. It'll take all of us to do all that we can to remember our purpose, with determined focus, stay the course of engaging people with the gospel of Jesus, the gospel of new life. Where each of us are inviting, using our gifts and talents, and each of us are giving and investing, and each of us are telling people, hey, we are the one who meet at the top of the hill. This purpose and our focus, attention to this from all of us. There's going to be high times, there are going to be low times. There are going to be times when God moves, and there are going to be times where we're going to be frustrated with Him or with each other. But it all starts here. See, the redemptive work of Jesus can be seen all over this story. Jesus is the Messiah. He came to fulfill all the requirements of the law, so that going to the cross, He would once and for all pay for it all and rebuild the connection, the relationship between us and the Father. So the question for us really is, do we know Him?